Let's do a brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to you, Michael. So this is the third segment of our customer education series, and I'm actually really excited about this one. We had a great discussion yesterday with Fran about, finding funding sources and driving more urgency to addressing the detection gap that a lot of companies have. And so, Fran has a lot of great insights from his background. But I'll hand it over to Michael, and he can set us up, introduce Fran, and we'll get going. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'm excited too. So here's where we're at. This is a 5-part series. In the first part of the conversation, we talked about this mindset of assuming breach. It's the reality that we're no longer in a place where we can pretend that nothing bad will ever happen. But what we started to realize was that if you adopt that mentality, if you assume that there's a breach, then you've got some questions to ask, and that it means that we have some opportunities. And part of getting to those opportunities is slowing down the way that we measure or take stock of things so we can plan. And the real takeaway from that first conversation was the need to communicate better, to tell a better story. I think you're going to see that continues to weave its way through this whole series. And the good news is the series kind of lays that out. So in the last segment, right before the holiday, Ron Wilson joined us, and we talked about how to actually measure and evaluate those tools, how to start to take a look at if or how your mindset is shifting. And what I loved about it was he shared some real specific insights into how people are acting, what people are doing, what they're experiencing. And then we shared with people how to calculate the value of your time as well as the value of the time of your team. And when you take a value of an hour and you start putting that against stuff, let's just say we found there's a shocking amount of waste. And those are the types of things that allow you to look for those areas where you can make changes and get some rapid wins and demonstrate value to other people. So today, we're going to talk about funding. We're going to talk about making that pivot, lining yourself up with the business, how we need to embrace and look at the things that have changed around us, and if and when we need to go get some more money, how to do it. To keep in perspective how this works, this isn't designed to be a presentation. What we've been looking at from an educational perspective is the need and the desire to engage in conversations. So we shared content out yesterday, and it pretty much gives a blueprint for what we're going to talk about today. Now, in the preparation with Fran yesterday, I'm excited. There's some stuff that Fran's going to share and his experience is going to show through, and that's really powerful, and that's part of the idea, that this is a conversation. So if you've got questions, feel free to ask them as we're going through this, and feel free to follow up with us afterwards. I'm going to take some time at the end of the day today. I'm going to step back, and I'm going to think about what we've already shared and what we learned through our discussion today, and I'm going to capture some of those highlights, and we'll publish those out on Thursday. So you'll have those as well. And you have access to those for all of the parts of the series. And we've been converting these recordings into, they've been transcribed. So you could actually get through everything now in a matter of minutes. You can read through everything and skim for the highlights and really put yourself on a much more solid footing, and that's our goal. So to recap kind of where we're at in terms of our conversation today, let me take you through about 5 slides. This will take about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to introduce Fran. So we're talking here about the funding and what we need, and of course this is the setup to our conversation today. One of the things that we've noticed is that when somebody is new in their position, they've either been promoted to CISO or they're the security leader, they've come into the organization. I've seen this as well with CFOs and CIOs. They have a tendency to say, well, what do we know? What do we not know? Now, what we talk here is that they have this realization that there's a gap. Now, Fran's got a great point on this, and so we're going to come back to gaps in a minute because I actually now like Fran's perspective on this a lot better than what we started with. But what happens is the goal is to come in and to say, okay, I don't want to show up in the papers, and I really don't want to find out if there's a problem through somebody else. So what do I need to do to figure out what exists? And the challenge with that then is that sometimes we don't always get that same perspective ourselves. We've been in the position, we've fought, I don't want to say we fought battles, but we've had to make the case to get the funding. We've tried to understand what we need to do in order to get something in place. And so once it's there, we're excited and we feel good, and that's on to the next and on to the next and on to the next. And sometimes it's a little tougher to get that distance, to step back and say, well, if I was new today, what would I do? What would I look for? How would I do it? And that's part of what we're talking about today, both the need to do that, and again, Fran's got some great insights on how to do that. What we'll also talk about then is, so what does business expect from security? And look, it's possible that somebody in the business does expect that security will protect all the bad things from ever happening to anything. That's not, it wouldn't be unsurprising. It wouldn't be terribly surprising because it's a holdover from this bias of prevention. And that doesn't mean prevention's bad, but what we're talking about then is that really what the business needs and the dialogue that we need to have is to establish a confidence, a mutual confidence that we understand what's most important to the business and that the business understands that we're doing what we can to protect that. And that in the event of a problem, we detect it rapidly, but not just respond to it, that we respond appropriately, that we do the right things, that we're protecting what matters to the business. And again, without giving it away, Fran's got just some great ways of thinking about this that I think are going to really help you make these connections a lot better. So of course, what this tends to lead to a lot of times is somebody says, well, I don't have budget for this. Some companies have a budget cycle that happens every other year, every third year, right? We try to look out and project what's going to happen. Well, the landscape has changed. And as these types of things change, what it does is it creates an opportunity for us to sometimes look for funding. There may be other ways to get something funded. There may be other ways to make the case, or you may find that there are places where you can save from parts of the budget and apply them. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about how we can make that case. The last part then, and we're going to talk about this a couple times, is that the action here is what demonstrates the strength. This is the leadership position. A lot of people, and I get it, you know, when I started in security, I was sat down and told, you know, if you screw up, everybody's going to notice, but if you do a good job, they probably won't. So we've been conditioned that if we go back and say, hey, I need something else, hey, we need to make another investment, hey, we need something, that it could be construed as a sign of failure, a sign that we didn't get something right or whatever. And it's the exact opposite. And so we're going to get a chance to touch on that as well as we get to go through with it. So here's the exciting thing. So we're joined today by Fran Travis. Fran is actually the chairman of the board of directors at Damballa. But the neat thing about it is he's an investor across multiple technology companies, and that's after a pretty stellar career as a CIO and even sometimes a CISO, and certainly with security responsibilities across a lot of big names, multiple institutions, industries well recognized and well recognized for their abilities. And his last opportunity was with Bell South. Fran, excited to have you here today. And what I think is interesting is you talked about, you know, how you're excited to be part of Damballa. Since you're the chairman of the board, do you just mind giving us a quick second or two as to, you know, why? Like, what excites you about this and this opportunity? And thanks, of course, for joining us today.
Oh, thanks, Mike. I've looked at where we were. You know, I've worn the hat that many of the people who are going to be listening to this have had in the past, and I looked at where security has been. And as I viewed all of the investments that people were making in security, it was all around building walls, you know, all around protecting, and all around the idea that if we could just get a wall thick enough, or if we can just get enough things out there, we will, in fact, protect the enterprise. And as Michael talked about already, and we've seen in the news, that hasn't happened. And when I saw what Damballa was doing initially, and the fact that what they were really looking at was how do you effectively identify and recover from threats in the business. And really, I'm much more aligned around business continuity and recovery than I am around protection. I mean, protection is great, but the fact that we can't protect anything from everybody is a problem. And so the question that we all have who are running companies and on boards of directors is how do we continue to keep the business running? How do we minimize the impact? And Michael said that I worked at Bell South. You know, one of my last permanent positions was in charge of all technology for Bell South. And and we had the 9 southeastern United States. Those states are not exactly known for not having environmental impact things like hurricanes and tornadoes and everything else. So when you're sitting there with a data center in Mississippi and one in Alabama and one in North Carolina and a bunch of other small data centers in Florida and all the other places that are hit, you think not only about, well, gee, how do I protect those data centers? How do I build them up, get them in a way where, they can be protected from stuff, but understand that you're eventually going to get hit by something. And so the question always was, in the physical world, how do I recover? And so what attracted me to Damballa is that same type of philosophy, is how do I best recover from any sort of breach? How do I best identify the severity of the breach, where it is, what it's going to impact, and then how do I get the business back online? So I really thought of Damballa from the very beginning as a really important element in and around business continuity and recovery. And so that's what attracted me to come here and help Damballa focus on this element of the business. In the early years that we had, just for full disclosure, the early years, we were coming against the backdrop of a bunch of people saying, we'll protect you, you don't need to worry about this other stuff, we'll protect you. And some people got placed a little bit ahead of us in line. And now that people understand that protection is something that cannot 100% guarantee, people are knocking on our door to look at the type of technology that we have to help them recover and minimize the effect on their business. So I'm excited about the company. That's kind of why I'm here.
No, that's great. And, I love the perspective that you're bringing, even looking at it from a recovery perspective. You're going to give us some language to take a look at and some ways to think about stuff. Now, you pointed out something yesterday that I love, so let me go ahead and set it up. I already mentioned, we've got gaps. We've got to embrace that we've got gaps. And you don't agree with that. Tell us more about how we might be better off thinking about it.
Yeah, I grew up as a technologist. I've been a CIO at 6 or 7 different institutions. I've had to go in front of audit committees of the board. I've had to justify our budget, to do all the stuff that everybody perhaps who is listening to this had to do. And when you use the word gap, it's saying, oh, I missed something. There's a hole someplace. And I don't believe we have gaps, because that's assuming that if we plug a gap, we're 100% protected. What we have and what's emerged in our environment is a new reality. And the reality is that the bad guys are as smart as we are. That people, especially in nation states, are coming with techniques to go around and through whatever protection we put up. Now, we don't have to give up and say, oh my gosh, that's it. We're going to take all of our protection down. We still have to make it difficult and very difficult for people to come through. However, it's not a gap. It's a new reality. It's the reality of the fact that there are people who are spending their waking hours on trying to figure out how to get around the walls that we put up, the protections that we've put there. And so by going in front of your board and saying we have a gap, the first thing they're going to think of is there's a hole, so plaster it over and we won't have a gap anymore. Rather than to say what we have is a new reality. And the new reality is that people are coming up with ways of dealing with everything we put out in front, and our job is to minimize the damage that those people can do to our company. So we have to understand the nature of the threats, we have to react to those threats, and we have to recover from those threats. That's not a gap.
Yeah, I love that. And what I love about that is it absolutely changes the way, it changes the whole dynamic of that conversation. As you suggested, if we go out and say, well, I got some gaps, it's a logical assumption then, it's, okay, well, what'd you miss? But when you come out instead and say, guys, the world changed, and here's what we know, and here's what it means for us, and here's what we can do, do you see that? Is that the right way then to start this discussion with the board?
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays, by the way, I'm on a bunch of boards. So nowadays the boards are starting the discussion with the technical people. But in case it hasn't, I think everybody needs to enlighten their board and enlighten their senior managers of the fact that the world has changed. And if they haven't been reading the paper, I would get a bunch of headlines in a presentation and say, look, here it is, Social Security Administration, Affordable Care Act, Target, Sony, I mean, everybody, okay? There are, and started from there, and to say that the development of the bad guys in technology has been such that we have to also not only think about disaster recovery in the physical sense, but cyber disaster recovery in the cyber sense. And I think I would very much, and I'm working with boards at very large companies now, to ask those type of questions and to understand that where in the past the responsibility of protection was on the CISO and the CIO, the responsibility for business continuity is at the board. The responsibility for disaster recovery, to make sure that money is spent on disaster recovery, business continuity, is a board, Sarbanes-Oxley, fiduciary responsibility. And if they haven't addressed that in their budgets, then they're going to be liable.
That's powerful. That's what, and I want to just kind of thread that needle too. It's not that it's a hammer to wield. It's just that it's a new reality, and it means we need to be prepared to have those discussions. Let's talk then about what that means from a business perspective, because I think as that reality has shifted, I mean, in the intro we talked about, well, what does business actually expect from security? Let's talk about what this means then. I mean, so what does the board need to think about, or what does that therefore mean the executives and the business leaders need to think about, and what conversations do we need to have to make sure that what we're doing is advancing that?
Well, there's two levels of conversation. I can tell you at the board, what we worry about at boards is the value of the brand. And a brand, if you look at a company that's a $100 billion company, there could be as much as 30–40% of that $100 billion is really the brand. What do people, and it goes really beyond the retail thing. I mean, if you look at, Target, for example, how much they lost in brand value based on the breach was significant. And so people, the boards worry about brand, and that's why CEOs in their interaction with the board worry about that. And that's where business continuity and disaster recovery is all about. Senior executives in the business worry about brand, of course, because that's part of their, stock compensation. But they really worry about operations. And in their view is how quickly can we get back to an operating environment. The discussions people have when they talk about disaster recovery, for example, are in two levels. When they talk to the board says, look, I just want the brand, I don't want to hit on the brand. In terms of the operating people, they say, yeah, how much are we going to spend on this? We can run in the degraded mode and we can still get our operations out. We can still get our products and services out. And so the operating people are going to look at what I would call mean time to recovery, or, how do you get back to where you were? And they may be fine to run in the degraded mode. The board, however, may not like that degradation in terms of its brand impact. So there's two levels of conversations and two levels of kind of dialogue, and you as the person who's in the middle have to kind of monitor that, have to come up with a level setting to allow you to get the appropriate budget and not at the same time go overboard in terms of what you're spending on it. We all know this in the technical community. We all know this because we've lived through disaster recovery in our years, and how much people want to or don't want to spend on it.
In your experience, I mean, I'm thinking a little bit, even crossing into some of the physical stuff, a lot of times when we go to the business and say, hey, what matters to you? The first answer is yes, all of it. Yeah, everything. So do you find that when you approach people but change the language by talking about if something happens and you need to be operational to meet your goals, to make your number, what do you really need? Do you find people tend to kind of open up and talk about it? Are they even sure of it? I mean, is this a simple conversation? Is this an ongoing series of conversations? What do we need to know to make this more effective?
Well, I think what any business, and I'll put my other hat on, my running a business hat. What you really want to know is what's the return on the investment. And so, if I spend $30 million on disaster recovery, on building a mirror data center and all the other types of stuff, and that's never hit, or the chances of it being hit in a tornado is once every 5 years, and then that $30 million is really not giving me a good return. Now, if I knew it was imminent and I didn't have it, that would be worth more than that, 10 times as much as that. So the discussion is around what's the benefit of quick recovery. And the business will, if you say to somebody, look, if we buy this recovery tool and we spend $5 million on this recovery tool, I can pretty much assure you that we can respond to anything and be back up in X number of days. And the business may say, that's great. If we spend half of that, could we have X plus Y number of days? So it's a discussion around how much quote unquote downtime does a business want. At the board, that's a whole different discussion. The board basically, you'll get some contention between the board and the business folks, because the board won't want anything that they believe would affect the brand image. And so they tend to lean on, I want 100%. The business people who have to meet their quarterly profit targets will tend to go back and forth on that. However, it's my experience that no business person will say zero. And no business person will say, 'cause we do have recovery right now. I mean, it's a bunch of people, after a breach has happened, a bunch of people trying to go and figure out what happened and how long it's going to take to resolve that. So there is a timeline already. The timeline, unfortunately, is not acceptable to the boards or to other people. And so what we're dealing with really now is shortening that time frame from a place where it is so long and we're hit by so many different types of things that our reacting time is really business impactful. Let me give you a story that is a little bit of a tangent. I was walking through one of my data centers one time, and I walked past the master terminal console, and the whole thing was lit up in red. It had error messages like crazy on it, going on and on and on. And I got the guy and I go, what's happening? Is, the end of the world? He goes, no. Every time we get any sort of error on any one of our 40,000 disk drives that we have, we get this error message. And I said, well, embedded in one of those is a comet is about to hit, and we're all going to go to hell in a handbag. I mean, how do you figure that out? And he says, I just got to go through it, and sometimes I miss it. That's where we are in recovery right now. There's so many things that people are coming through, so we have to shorten that. No number of people working on this is going to shorten that without some help. And so I think in helping your conversations, to frame it in the fact that, yes, you are worried about recovery, and in fact, you are spending money on recovery right now when a breach happens. However, you know, it's coming so fast and furious that you have to get better at it.
What would you say to the board that when we approach them, right? So business perspective, and we need to do this, and they say, yeah, no, look, we've been here for 20 years. Nothing's ever happened. It's all overblown. I've read the paper. It's not going to happen to us. What do you say?
If your board, I'm going to be pretty blunt on this one. If your board does not realize that they can be breached, then I would, if I were you, get another job. Because sooner or later, that's going to happen, that you will get another job. Because the board is going to turn to you and say, and turn to your CEO first, and then turn to you and say, how come you didn't let us know that? And you could say what you want, and I told you so, and, you know, I remember I told you, that's not going to work. So if you have a board or a senior management team, and I'm really serious about this, I am a technical person. I'm a member of the technical community. I also am a board and an investor. If you're in the technical community and you're not getting what you need to get to protect and to recover, then you will be short-term in that job, and you could have a career-affecting instance that is very difficult to recover from.
That's great advice. I mean, that's really solid. And what I like about this too, and you and I touched on this a little bit yesterday too, is if you only have a protection plan, you're half-baked. And, you know, I like that you talked about there are certain things that you need to put in place for protection. It's the smart strategy, and it keeps a lot of the stuff out. But these days, if you don't have a way to get to continuity, and I like it when we say it even simpler, if you can't keep the business running, or you can't get them back to that operating state really quickly, you've only got half of your plan, and I don't think it's smart to be operating half-baked these days.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm sure everybody who's listening to this either now or later will say, well, we have a bunch of people who we have that are our recovery team, and everybody does, except are they overwhelmed? I mean, to give them, it's kind of, you know, there's a bunch of people who are rowing the boat to get you to shore, but there's this giant hole in the boat, and there's nobody there who's taking the water out. So you may have, you know, 30 people rowing the boat, but you're not going to get to shore very easily if the boat's got a huge leak. And so you've got to help your current recovery process. And, you know, that's, yeah, this sounds like a commercial for Damballa. You know, obviously, you know, I'm biased, but that's really why, you know, I toss my hat in the ring. Anybody who's helping the recovery teams to do their job better and to minimize the damage to the corporation is a very valuable thing to a company right now.
I love it. I mean, there is so much there for people to think about. All right, so let's talk about budget then. What I'm hearing and what I like is that we're changing the language, which is kind of cool, and we're changing the approach. So we're not saying you got a gap and you screwed up. We're not saying that anything other than the world has changed and we need to change with it, and protection is good, but it's not enough. And you might be doing some stuff manually, but you got to get better at being able to do it. So that typically means there's got to be some spend in here. I look at my budget and go, oh, I got nothing. There's nothing I can do. So what should I do? I mean, I like to make the case that what we can do is we go look for funding. Most organizations, they have money. It's either saved from a project that never started, there was this cost saving someplace else, or there's usually a pool of money someplace that says, hey, if we need it, we can use it. Is this the kind of thing we can tap into, and how would you approach that?
Well, I think it's there's really two buckets to look at when you're looking at it. And my folks from Damballa don't particularly agree sometimes when I say this, but I would go at the disaster recovery budget and the business continuity budget, and not necessarily the security budget, because I mean, you can say, right, this thing is security related. But, I mean, it's kind of like, saying that you're going to build a second data center and you really want to go after the construction budget. Well, yeah, it is construction, but the reason why you're doing it, in terms of something that Damballa offers, is not to increase your protection, it's to decrease your risk and to decrease the impact of any sort of intrusion in your company. And so, I would look at the business continuity spend and say, we need to spend a little more on business continuity. I mean, look, if you were in a hurricane region, or say this, if you were in Oklahoma right now, and you're starting to get earthquakes, and you've never had earthquakes before, it's your job to go and tell the board that the world has changed and you need to have a place to have your data center secured that doesn't have an earthquake to it, or you need to have backup when you didn't have to have it before. So this idea that the world has changed is an important one around our commitment as a technical community to keep businesses running.
Does it make sense then to get the business leaders involved in making that case for the budget? I'll give a quick example from my past. We were working on a project where the business leaders didn't understand it, and they hated everything about it. And then we sat down and we drew it out, literally on the board, and they looked at it and they went, oh, that's what you guys are talking about? Well, actually, I need that. If I give you guys some money for that and I can dedicate some resources to it, can we get that faster? And all of a sudden, it went from a project that was completely stuck, that nobody wanted, to a project that had more than enough both funding and support for it. Do you see this kind of the same way? Because what I liked is, we're not saying it's more protection. What we're saying is, okay, we get it. These things are important to you. If I can find a way to help you get back online faster, if I can make sure that you're able to meet your goals, are we, almost tin cupping and asking people to contribute to this? Or do you think that's not even necessary?
Well, it's the way I would frame it is very similar to what you said. It's really around telling the business right now, our recovery capability is X number of days. If we get hit with a, type of attack, which gets through our protection defenses, depending on the type of attack, we could be, a couple hours, several days, whatever the number is, until we get back on track. And, so it's important to be able to reference, and by the way, I would be very conservative in the current state of how much you commit, how quickly you can get the business back up to where it was. At the worst, you would have to say, we are going to refresh every connected device in our network, and that's going to take a week. After we refresh every connected device to put it back to a pre-breached environment, then we can say unassuredly right now that you can be back. And so whatever that is, maybe that's a week, maybe that's 2 weeks. Or you could, by putting in some tool sets, change that time frame significantly and minimize the downtime significantly. The business folks then are your supporters. I mean, if they believe that they have to deal with a X number of week outage because of an intrusion, then they will be supportive of spending money on lessening that. The board is even more supportive because the board believes that every significant outage, which causes the business to essentially shut down, is really an amazing impact upon a brand. So those companies that have had to stop doing certain parts, if not all of their business, because of a breach, and essentially took the business offline, saying, okay, we're not going to accept anybody's credit card, or we're not going to allow access to any of our websites, or we're not going to take any new orders for insurance on the healthcare website. Whatever people have had to do for X number of days is the current state. And our job in technology is to lessen that, to get it as close to being real time as possible.
I'm really enjoying the picture that you're painting of boards, because I think that a lot of folks maybe don't understand the makeup of the boards or haven't had a lot of interaction with it. So, I mean, what you're describing is a group that's mindful, paying attention, aware of security, interested in this. So it sounds to me like they're allies in this. But what I like, what we just talked about, is get the business to be an ally and a supporter, and the board becomes a natural supporter, especially, when it just comes to asking questions like, and again, reframing it about cyber disasters, where, again, I mean, it seems to me like early detection and early action are still important when we look at these types of things.
Oh, yeah. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We can't, as I said earlier, we can't just open the doors and say, everybody come in and then we'll recover. That's not it. But I can tell you that the SEC and others are getting involved with putting responsibility on the board, just like they did on Sarbanes-Oxley, for ensuring that the business has continuity. And in fact, I'm working with some boards and writing up the development of a technology and security committee of the board that will be either part of the risk committee of the board or a separate committee in and of itself. So you will see, I believe, over the next few years, a formal responsibility specifically around intrusion and breach management, just like we had on access and protection under Sarbanes-Oxley. And that will be another public board responsibility. That's actually pretty encouraging.
All right, so Fran, we've got a question. And the question is, would you recommend talking directly to the board to assist the internal champions in order to get the funding? So would you go to the board to help cultivate those internal champions? And when you've got a couple, does that give everybody the leverage to make this happen? How do you see that working?
Well, I always like, first of all, I would seek the guidance of the CEO as the bridge between the operating function of the company and the board. And I would be surprised. I have not heard in the last 3 months of any board not asking the question around what are we doing around these breaches. I mean, they may, and so I would, I mean, there may be one, but the ones that I know have all asked, and I know about 10 different CIOs, have all asked the CIOs and the CEOs, what are we doing on this? I mean, they just, read in the news about, unfortunately, the Target experience, and every retail company then, their boards definitely asked what's happening. It was an agenda item on almost every audit committee or any other committee that is associated with it. So, I think what we sometimes miss in the technical community is really what's happening at the board level. This is a topic of discussion at the board level anyways. So I would doubt that you have to initiate it. If you feel you have to initiate it, then I would use the guidance of the CEO. And again, I go back to, we're all big people. If the CEO and the board doesn't realize this, then you're not in the right company.
No, that makes sense. I'm actually enjoying that. All right, so let's talk about the CEO for a second then. One of the topics that comes up when we're looking at this is really simple. What's good enough? What's the good enough level, right? So we can spend a lot of money, we can spend a little money. We're going to try to measure the return so we balance it out. So how do we get that right?
Well, if your current methodology on recovery is throwing people at the problem, then you're probably, one, spending too much, and two, not recovering quickly. So people without a really effective recovery tool set, there's a lot of protection and a lot of identification tool sets, but without a recovery tool set, are just going to be floundering about trying to figure out what direction they're being hit in and how do they correct it. So, if you tell your senior management that you've got 20 people or 30 people or 50 people or 100 people who are working on this, and you don't have them with a really effective tool set that allows them to prioritize the type of breaches that are coming in, that allows them to focus on the severity of the incursions that are coming in, but just identify just the number of incursions. One of my friends told me that he's getting, close to a billion messages that are attempting to come into their network. I mean, I could tell you 10 years ago, or not, actually 8 years ago, I was getting 3,000 incursions a day to try to get at the public switch network. And at that time, I was still believing that we could prevent that. And, and they were all coming from, nation states and other places. They weren't the teenage hacker, trying to fool around. They were people trying to get at the public switch network to come in. So looking at the number that's coming in and thinking of it as being a manual effort to recover from it without the effective set of tools to help is a fool's errand.
Yeah, and you know what I like too, listening to you, and I like the contrast between your experience and what people are experiencing now. A decade ago, trying to make this case would be, well, there's no real breaches that are public, but let me tell you what we've heard. Let me tell you what we've seen. Now there's so many that are public, and there's such a diversity of what's happened across sectors and the attacks and what the impacts have been. At least we can say, well, this is what happened to someone else. And if they don't love it or agree with it, then at least we got a starting point for it. So let's wrap up and talk about action then, and the need to take action on this. Because as we've already said, I mean, I like the fact we're shifting. It's not a gap, that the world has changed, but I still think a lot of folks are sitting and maybe even listening to us now saying, well, that's all well and good, but I don't have that relationship with my board. I don't have that relationship with my CEO. I'm not sure if anybody's going to listen to me, and I already added a bunch of tools into my budget this year, and those projects are all coming in now. I'm not sure this is a good time to go have that conversation. What do you think?
Well, what I used to tell guys working for me, you know, I had a $2 billion a year budget in my last job, is if you are concerned about asking for money and the unthinkable happens, and the answer is that you didn't ask for this because you thought I wouldn't approve it because of the money, then it's on you. So what you have to do is you have to put it in front of the people. One of the biggest issues we have as a technical community is this, I call it plausible deniability. We protect senior executives because we're concerned that they're going to say no, and then it's going to be on them. And I have to tell you, the most difficult things that a CEO has to hear is that their current state isn't what it should be. Because when they hear that, they are legally obligated to take that and correct that because of their fiduciary responsibility. So sometimes, you know, it's going to be like, you know, the sergeant in Hogan's Heroes, like, I know nothing, I know nothing. But that's not going to save your job, because sooner or later, some's going to get through and they're going to say, what could you have done to have recovered quicker? And if you know what you could have done and you have not done that because you haven't put it on the table, then again, it's on you. And so you got to put it on the table. I mean, we who are leading companies and who are on boards expect that there's going to be some tension in prioritizing spend. But we expect all the data in front of us so that we can make the judgment on whether or not, you know, plan B or plan C or plan D is the right thing for us. And so my advice is put it on the table, put it and make sure that it gets to at least, if you're not the CIO or CISO, at least the person who is that, at least a C-level person making a decision on that. Because if you don't, you're not doing your job. And if you're a CIO and you're not talking to the CEO about that, you're not doing your job. Just not.
It feels too like what you're suggesting is the cost of inaction outweighs the cost of action. But what I'm also hearing is that if something bad happens and somebody says, yeah, you know, I thought about that last week, you're going to be upset because last week would have been a great time to talk about it. But more importantly, it doesn't seem like somebody comes to you and says, hey, Fran, look, I know we just put these things in. The world has changed. The situation's shifted. I've got this concern, and I'd like to look at this solution to fix it. It doesn't seem then like you or any other seasoned executive is going to fly off the handle and go, oh, you're killing me with all this. This is absolute nuts. You must be incompetent. If you've presented your argument logically and appropriately, it might be we'll go put it in the pile and we'll see where it shakes out. But at least it's not met with the, wow, you're a total failure. Right? Is that the takeaway?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, don't make assumptions on prioritization of spend at the level that isn't the prioritizing of spend level. So,
absolutely.
You know, I mean, just don't do that. A lot of people do that. Like, you know, I know we're having a budget crunch, and man, last thing I want to do is put that in front of my supervisor, boss, CIO, CEO, because, you know, they got to earn their money too. You know, they've got to help on prioritization. It's their job, and, you know, this is spoken from a board member's perspective. It's their job to make the tough choices to keep the business running. And it may be when I would go in, and I've been a CIO at 7 different companies, a little bit of a tangent. When I would go in and take over as a CIO, and I would come in, the first thing I would do is a current state assessment, and I would tell the CEO what their current state really is from the business's perspective. And that was not pretty news for anybody. And it was all the idea that, and I remember one time a very famous CEO at Wall Street just screaming at me, saying it was the worst meeting he's ever had. And the reason why is because we were holding up a mirror and saying the current state is $700 million different than what you thought it was. And so our job is to do that. It's not to be, it's not to prevent those people from facing up to the decisions that they need to face up to. And in my career, I've always been able to leave a job saying I did what I was supposed to do. And if the company didn't want to take that advice, at least I did my part.
This has been fantastic. Fran, you have shared a ton of information, and I know that gives people a lot to think about. As we wrap up, I'm going to ask you real quick to think about the one thing that you think people could take away or act on as a result of our time today. I'll tell you the thing that's sticking out for me is by reframing it, even if somebody's not comfortable going after BCP, DRP money, just talking in terms of how quickly I can get you back, how quickly we can let you hit your numbers and do what it is that you need to do. Total way to change that conversation. I think that's really powerful. Is there one thing that stands out to you, somebody listening to this, when they step away and they reflect on this, is there one thing that they should really kind of hone in on? Because we covered a ton of stuff.
Yeah, I just would, if you don't know your mean time to recovery from a serious breach, take the most serious breach that could happen possibly to you and see what your mean time to recovery would be from that. If you know that, that's the thing to take away. That's your baseline. That's what you start with.
Perfect. Wow. Well, thank you so much. Here's what we have coming up. I'm going to step back. I've taken pages of notes. I can't wait. I'm going to dig in. I'm going to reflect on this today and tomorrow. We're going to have a column. It's going to come out Thursday. You can continue along with us at the website here and continue to look for these updates and the transcript of everything else. Next week, we're going to be with the CTO of Damballa, Brian Foster. And what's great about this is what Damballa does, and the way to start to think about detection differently, as even we talked about today, it's not just people, it's not just manual processes. There's a different way to think about this. And so what we're going to take a look at is, so if you're going to build a solution, what do your requirements need to be? What do you need to think about? How are you going to do that? How are you going to prioritize that response then so that you can keep that business moving? And when you're building and you're using one of these types of solutions, is it helping you get better at everything else? Is it improving what you're doing overall? There's some real neat stuff there. We're going to get an inside look at big data. We're going to talk about data science. We're going to talk about machine learning. These are concepts I see all over the place, and we're going to get a chance to actually break them down, understand them, and think about how they're going to benefit us as we go forward. So that'll be next week. You can look for that conversation primer to come out on Monday. Tuesday, conversation at noon Eastern. So thanks, everybody. This was fantastic. Mark, back to you.